His name was erased from the records. His bravery credited to another. When the veteran boldly wrote, he left U.S. on a war memorial, he was arrested. But a photo of the act went viral, and the internet demanded answers. Who was this man? Why had his story been buried for 2 decades? As the truth unraveled, all eyes turned to the courtroom. What would the court decide in his fight against the Ministry of Defense? The shoebox rattled softly as Colonel Mason Trent set it down on the thin mattress of his cot. Its edges were frayed, its cardboard buckling at the corners from years of handling, weather, and regret. He opened it like a sacred ritual. Inside, beneath a folded American flag, lay 6 medals, each duller than the last, and a few brittle newspaper clippings, yellowed with time and smudged by the oils of his fingers. One article was from Stars and Stripes, dated 2003, Colonel Trent leads final push in Operation Silent Edge. No one remembered Operation Silent Edge anymore. No one remembered Mason. His boots, cracked leather and missing a lace, thudded against the cold concrete floor of the city shelter as he sat down. The cot groaned under his weight. Fluorescent lights above hummed with the kind of institutional indifference he'd grown used to. Across the room, a man mumbled to himself in sleep. Another coughed so hard it echoed. Mason reached into the shoebox again and pulled out a photo of his old unit. 12 men grinning through sand and sun, camouflage sweat-stained, and rifles at ease. 2 of them were dead now. One had lost both legs. Mason, standing in the middle, had looked like a man carved from discipline, squared shoulders, eyes like steel, the American flag fluttering behind him. That man no longer existed. He had walked into the VA office 2 years ago with a clean uniform, pressed documents, and a hopeful heart. He had walked out broken. His file had been misplaced. According to the clerk, his service was under review. A second visit led to a third. Then letters. Then silence. He appealed, sent documentation, mailed a certified copy of his discharge papers. No response. One day he called and a voice said coldly, "There's no Colonel Trent listed in active records." Just like that. 32 years erased with a keystroke. His pension stopped shortly after. The bank repossessed his car. Then his apartment. He lived on a buddy's couch for a while, but pride burned too hot. So he left. Now, at 68, he ate in soup kitchens and shared bunks with addicts. His only income came from the occasional odd job, moving crates, sweeping alleyways, and those came with more pity than pay. He once commanded 300 men across a war-torn valley under fire. Now, he waited in lines with his hands in his pockets and his head down. A staffer entered the room with a clipboard, called out names. Mason wasn't one of them. He never was. He was invisible now, a shadow in the system he once believed in. Even here, among the forgotten, he was more forgotten than most. He rubbed his shoulder. The shrapnel was still there, not enough to kill him, but enough to wake him every time he shifted the wrong way. They'd called him a hero back then. Now the VA called him Pending. On the cot beside him, someone had scribbled on the wall in charcoal, "Heroes are only heroes when they're useful." He stared at the words a long time. Behind his eyes, helicopters thumped over desert sands. Radios crackled. Screams. Silence. A heartbeat. He blinked back to the present. The shoebox closed with a soft thunk. He slid it under the bed. That was all he had left, memories in cardboard, and a body that betrayed him more every day. But he wasn't done. Not yet. The pawn shop smelled like gun oil and desperation. Mason held the medal in his palm for a long moment before placing it on the glass counter. A silver star. Fought tooth and nail for in Kandahar when a firefight pinned down an entire squad under mortar fire. He dragged 3 men to safety that day, 2 unconscious, 1 screaming and blind. The shop owner barely glanced at it. $15. Mason didn't flinch. It's real. So's the market. The man tapped his fingers on the counter. Take it or leave it. He took it. Not because he wanted to, but because the hunger gnawed too deep to argue. Outside, the sky threatened rain, gray as metal, thick as guilt. He tugged his coat tighter around his ribs. It used to be a military-issue field jacket. Now it was a damp rag with memories. His boots were soaked, his stomach hollow, his dignity long since dissolved in the acid of indifference. He shuffled 2 blocks to a convenience store and bought a stale sandwich and a bottle of water. The first bite felt like betrayal. The second like survival. Later that day, he wandered into the free clinic with a cough that had been rattling his lungs for a week. The receptionist looked over her glasses, took in his coat, his beard, his silence. "We're full," she said, even though 4 chairs sat empty behind him. "I was told to come. Try again next week." He pressed his veteran ID to the glass. She barely glanced at it. "Sir, I said we're full." A man behind him whispered, "Freeloader." Mason turned slowly, met the man's eyes. Didn't speak. The man looked away. By nightfall, the wind had turned sharp. He wrapped a piece of cardboard around himself under the overpass, the cement cold enough to suck the heat from bone. Rats scurried nearby. Somewhere in the distance, sirens cried. Rain dripped from cracks in the concrete like a slow leak in time. He dreamed of fire. Not warmth, but memory. Flashes of muzzle bursts. Sand in his teeth. A helicopter spiraling. A friend named Harris screaming into static. Then, bang. A slamming car door jolted him awake. His stomach clenched. Hunger. Pain. The two had become indistinguishable. The next day, Mason dragged himself to the city's veteran town hall meeting. He'd circled the date in a flyer weeks ago. It was supposed to be a place for veterans to be heard. He stood at the back of the room in his tattered coat, waiting for the mic. Speakers went up one by one. City council members nodded, took notes, posed for photos with polished veterans who spoke of community gardens and flag-raising ceremonies. When Mason stepped forward, gripping a crumpled statement in his hand, the moderator leaned in and whispered, "Sir, we're out of time. Thank you for your service." He opened his mouth anyway. "I served 32 years, he began. Someone clapped, trying to move him along. "I lost my pension because of bad records. I've written letters. I have no place to sleep. I've..." The mic cut out. A security guard touched his shoulder. He stood frozen. Then quietly turned and left without a word. Outside, the world went on. People in pressed shirts walked past him. Cars honked. Pigeons swarmed the breadcrumbs he couldn't afford to drop. He wandered, bitter wind pushing against his back, until he reached the War Memorial Park, a quiet hilltop space with stone walls etched with names. Names he knew. Names he bled with. He sat down beside the Korean War plaque and let the silence wrap around him. Then came the final indignity. A private security guard approached. "You can't sleep here." "I'm not sleeping. Just sitting. It's a restricted area at night. I fought for this country. That plaque, half those names were my friends. I'm just doing my job, sir. You need to leave." When he didn't move fast enough, the guard called another. Together, they lifted him by the arms. He didn't resist. Just stared up at the granite wall, at names engraved in stone, while his own was forgotten. As they pushed him out through the gate, someone passing by muttered, "Another drunk." No one asked his name. No one asked his story. Not that it mattered. The wind on Capitol Hill Park whipped cruelly that morning, sharp enough to peel skin, steady enough to keep the flags on the memorial taut in mid-flutter. Mason Trent sat on the stone bench again, fingers curled tightly around a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee donated by a passing volunteer. He hadn't taken a sip. He wasn't there for warmth or caffeine. He was staring at a plaque. It had been recently polished, the bronze glinting under the bleached sky. A wreath lay beneath it, plastic red poppies tangled with blue ribbons. The name carved into the metal was unmistakable. Lieutenant Bryce Tanner, hero of Operation Silent Edge. Mason's jaw tightened. He felt something rise in him, not anger exactly, but a heavy, smoldering heat that started in the gut and climbed toward the throat. Bryce Tanner. The man who abandoned his post in 2003. Who froze during the ambush. Who left radio contact for nearly an hour while Mason and his men were pinned, surrounded, nearly overrun. Mason had taken command, not by choice, but by necessity, leading the team to a flanking maneuver that broke the siege and saved 7 lives. And yet, Bryce had come home early. Decorated. Promoted. Photographed shaking hands with senators. And when Mason tried to report what really happened, when he filed the initial reprimand and sat for 2 official inquiries, the higher-ups made it clear, drop it. Too much publicity. Too much political cost. Mason had obeyed. Because that's what soldiers do. He hadn't spoken Tanner's name in 20 years. Until now. He stood slowly. Walked to the plaque. His fingers trembled as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a black permanent marker, a relic he'd picked up from a bus stop ad board weeks ago. With one steady hand, he wrote directly across the bronze. He left U.S. Then, underneath it, in smaller letters. Ask who really saved them. The letters bled against the metal like truth seeping through lies. He stepped back. His heart thundered. He expected guilt. He felt clarity. And then he walked. Around the base of the statue, a granite soldier frozen mid-charge, he stopped again and did something he never imagined himself doing. He pulled a small piece of paper from his wallet. It had been there for years, a scribbled list of names. The names of every man in his unit on that day. And he taped it to the stone. Then, with slow, deliberate motion, he scrawled across the base. Truth matters. He turned to leave, but a voice behind him barked, "Hey!" A park security guard was jogging toward him. "Stay where you are, sir." Mason didn't run. He didn't speak. He merely raised his hands and waited. When the men reached him, Mason quietly handed over his ID. The guard blinked, confused. "Colonel." The word felt strange after so long. Still, he said nothing. By the time he was handcuffed and placed in the back of the patrol car, a small crowd had gathered near the plaque. Some took photos. A few murmured. One woman with a camera zoomed in and read aloud, "He left us." Mason saw the wrinkle of her brow. Curiosity. Interest. That was new. The holding cell was cold and bright. Hours passed. Eventually, a young woman entered, public defender, judging by the overstuffed leather bag and too big blazer. She didn't shake his hand. Just sat, opened a folder, and glanced at him. "You vandalized a memorial," she said flatly. "I told the truth. Is there proof?" He shrugged. She raised an eyebrow. "Colonel Mason Trent, Afghanistan, 3 tours, Silver Star." She flipped a page. "But your VA file says you're unverified. No pension, no housing assistance. Why?" "You'd have to ask the Pentagon." She sat back. "I might." He looked at her. For a second, just a second, she reminded him of someone, a reporter embedded with them once. Tenacious, sharp-eyed. The kind who cared more about the truth than the paycheck. "Why did you write it?" she asked. He didn't blink. Because no one else would. That night, his mugshot hit the local news. The station ran a short segment, "Homeless Veteran Defaces Memorial, but claims to be the real hero." It was meant to be dismissive. But online, the photo of the vandalized plaque, the words, "Truth Matters," and the handwritten list, began spreading. One tweet read, "Who is Mason Trent?" Another, "If this guy's lying, prove it. But if he's telling the truth." People were starting to wonder. And for the first time in years. 3 days after the arrest, Mason Trent sat quietly in the corner of a low-rent legal office, staring at a corkboard layered with case files, eviction notices, and a faded, "Support Our Veterans" bumper sticker. The public defender, Claire Ruiz, was on her 3rd cup of coffee and 5th hour combing through a maze of military documentation, reports, and forgotten leads. Her office was chaos, legal pads covered with scribbled arrows, sticky notes clinging to the walls like battle maps. She thrived in it. "There's something off here," she muttered. "Something rotten." Mason said nothing. He'd seen enough cover-ups to know when someone had hit a nerve. Claire looked up. "Your disciplinary record is spotless. Not a single reprimand." Then suddenly, nothing. "Your file goes dark after May 2003. That's not normal. That's deliberate. She tapped a page. And here, this mission report is sanitized. No field testimonies, just a summary paragraph that reads like a press release. Mission led by Lieutenant Bryce Tanner, resulting in successful extraction with minor resistance. Mason scoffed under his breath. Minor resistance. Claire leaned back. What happened out there? He hesitated. Then, slowly, he told her. They were pinned in a dry riverbed just west of the Spin Boldak region. It was supposed to be a reconnaissance op, in, observe, out. But the intel was flawed. They walked into an ambush. 50 insurgents, mortars, RPGs, chaos. Lieutenant Bryce Tanner had panicked. Froze. Then ran behind a dune, radio silent for nearly 45 minutes while Mason took control. It was Mason who called in air support. Mason who dragged the wounded to cover. Mason who rallied the surviving men and fought their way back to the extraction zone. When the dust settled, Tanner reappeared, clean, untouched. And when the brass arrived, he spun the tale. Mason had stayed silent. Command wanted a hero, not a scandal. But I kept my own report, Mason said quietly, pulling a battered notebook from his coat. Names. Times. Coordinates. I wrote it all down. Claire stared at it as if it were a lit match. She scanned the pages. Her eyes widened. Jesus. This changes everything. Meanwhile, the photo of Mason's graffiti had taken on a strange life of its own. What had started as a smear piece had turned viral. A local veteran-run blog picked up the story. Then a national forum. Then a reporter from Stars and Stripes, a young journalist named Theo Brandt, requested an interview. Mason agreed, under one condition: no headlines, no exaggeration. Just the truth. Theo met Mason and Claire at the shelter's dining hall. They sat at a plastic table with chipped legs and steam rising from foam cups of broth. Theo recorded everything: the mission, the aftermath, the silence Mason had been forced into. Claire handed him copies of the notebook and VA correspondences. This isn't just about stolen valor, Theo said afterward. This is about burying a man alive. Days later, Theo's article hit the wire. The kernel they erased, inside the forgotten record of Mason Trent. It included a side-by-side comparison of Tanner's official statement and 3 corroborating anonymous interviews from Mason's former unit. One of them said, "If anyone deserves a statue, it's Trent." Tanner was never there when it mattered. The public's reaction was instant. Twitter flooded with hashtags like #HonorTrent and #TruthMatters. Veterans across the country shared similar stories of paperwork errors, lost pensions, benefits denied due to technicalities. Claire's inbox exploded with messages from legal watchdogs, advocacy groups, and even a retired general who quietly offered to testify. Even the Department of Defense couldn't ignore it anymore. The Office of Military Records, under growing media pressure, issued a statement: "We are conducting an internal review of Colonel Trent's service file." But Mason didn't want a press release. He wanted a hearing. Claire filed suit. Trent versus United States Department of Defense. It was a long shot. No one had ever won a personal restitution case against the DoD over a decades-old operational cover-up. But the tide was shifting. People were paying attention. One morning, Mason woke to find a letter tucked under his door. Typed. Official seal. "You are hereby summoned to appear at a public review hearing regarding the reinstatement of pension and benefits, and the correction of military records under U.S. Code Title 38. He sat on the edge of the bed, letter trembling in his hand. Not because he was afraid. Because he'd waited 20 years to be heard. And now, finally. He stayed silent to protect others. But silence had cost him everything. The hearing room was colder than expected. High ceilings, pale wood paneling, rows of identical chairs, and a long table at the front where 3 federal adjudicators sat like stone monuments. Cameras hummed softly in the back. Reporters whispered. Mason Trent sat upright, a clean button-down shirt pulled over his frail shoulders. Claire Ruiz sat beside him, her legal pad ready, jaw tight, eyes scanning everything. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. The gavel struck once. This hearing is now in session. The lead adjudicator, an older woman with thin silver glasses and a clipped tone, opened the floor. Colonel Mason Trent is here today to appeal for the correction of military records, reinstatement of full pension and benefits, and formal recognition of service actions during Operation Silent Edge, May 2003. She looked at Mason. "Colonel, do you wish to speak?" He stood slowly, hand steady. His voice was rough, but it carried. "I didn't come here today to reclaim money," he said. "I came to reclaim the truth." He paused. The room was still. "For 20 years, I carried a story no one wanted to hear. I obeyed orders. I stayed quiet. I let others call it heroism when it was cowardice. And I lived with it because I thought it was my duty to protect the institution. But now I see, silence doesn't protect integrity. It buries it." He sat down. Claire gave a small nod. Then came the testimonies. First was Sergeant Ben Riley, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, and visibly limping. He walked in with a cane and stopped in front of the panel. "I owe my life to Mason Trent," he said. "Tanner left us in that canyon. Trent took command. We weren't supposed to make it out. But we did. Because of him." The second was a woman in uniform, Captain Leah Barnes, formerly a medic in Trent's unit. "I watched the lieutenant flee the line. I patched the wounds Mason couldn't wait for medics to treat. He moved wounded men under fire. He radioed in evac. I remember every second. And I remember who stood with us. One by one, the stories came, not dramatic, not rehearsed. Just raw memory, sharpened by time." The adjudicators flipped pages. Whispered. Cross-checked names. Then they asked Bryce Tanner to appear. He declined. But a statement was read, one that tried to spin the situation as fog of war, confusion, and uncertain communications. It rang hollow. Claire stood. The Department of Defense accepted that version without question. And as a result, Colonel Trent lost everything. No trial. No hearing. No correction. Until now. Then she placed the notebook on the table. The one Mason had kept. Coordinates. Times. Tactical movements. All matching independent records Theo Brandt had uncovered in his report. It was airtight. By the end of the hearing, the lead adjudicator leaned back in her chair, removed her glasses, and sighed. "Colonel Trent," she said, "what was done to you was not only unjust, it was disgraceful. This panel recommends full reinstatement of your military pension and benefits, effective immediately. Further, we advise formal correction of all service records, and the Department of Defense will issue a public statement acknowledging your leadership during Operation Silent Edge." A pause. "And finally, your name will be added to the official memorial registry. Under commendation." Mason didn't cry. He nodded. Once. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Some were veterans. Others were just people who had read the article, watched the hearing, followed the case. They clapped when he stepped outside. A few saluted. Reporters surged forward. Theo Brandt held back, letting the moment breathe. Someone shouted, "Are you angry, Colonel?" Mason looked out at the crowd. "I'm not angry," he said. "I'm just done being erased." Later that week, the DoD issued an official apology. Bryce Tanner quietly resigned from a corporate board seat. The VA reached out to Mason personally to reprocess his benefits. But the moment that meant the most came the following day, when a city official visited Mason's shelter and delivered a sealed envelope. Inside, a letter from the Parks Commission. The Capitol Hill War Memorial plaque will be replaced. The new version will feature the names of those who truly led that day. Claire smiled when she read it. Mason just nodded. He didn't want revenge. He wanted the truth to stand on its own. It started with a plaque. Mason Trent sat in Capitol Hill Park, sipping lukewarm coffee, when his eyes locked onto a name etched in bronze, Lieutenant Bryce Tanner, hero of Operation Silent Edge. He froze. Tanner wasn't a hero. He had abandoned their unit under fire in 2003, going radio silent while Mason rallied the men and led them out. Command had swept it under the rug. Tanner got the medals. Mason got silence. Something in him broke open. He rose, walked to the plaque, and pulled out a marker. In bold letters, he scrawled, "He left US." Underneath, he added, "Ask who really saved them." Then he taped a handwritten list of the men in that squad, the ones who fought, who bled, beneath the bronze. Before he could leave, a park officer shouted. Mason didn't run. He handed over his ID and was quietly arrested. A journalist walking her dog snapped a photo of the plaque and posted it online. Within hours, the image was spreading fast. A man in cuffs, a defaced memorial, and a question burning under the surface: who was Mason Trent? In the holding cell, he met Claire Ruiz, young, sharp, and already intrigued. "You vandalized a war memorial," she said. "I corrected it," he replied. She didn't laugh. Instead, she studied his battered ID, his steady eyes, the quiet gravity behind every word. And for the first time in decades, Mason Trent wasn't ignored. He wasn't dismissed.